Hello, everybody, and welcome to the lecture on H.P. Lovecraft, one of the most well-known horror writers of the 20th century. Um, Probably other than Stephen King, the most oft-quoted or oft-copied horror writer of the last 150 years. So a very important character that we're going to be talking about today. To begin, we should probably know a little bit of some biographical information about Howard Phillips Lovecraft. He was born in Providence, Rhode Island, and that's where he spent most of his time until his death at the age of 47. He was a very lonely and sheltered child, very attached to his mother. Although his mother was extremely critical of him, he felt a kind of deep connection to her that when she died in 1921, his mother, when she passed away, he very actively considered suicide and didn't live terribly much longer after that. So both of his parents died being committed to an insane asylum. His father at a much younger age, but both succumbed to insanity at the end of their lives. So the theme of madness is one that plays a very pivotal role for Lovecraft. It's something that was very near and dear to him, kind of like going back to Edgar Allan Poe, a personal hero or literary inspiration for Lovecraft. Poe had that kind of tumultuous history, the estrangement from his father mixed with the frequent death to consumption by his female loved ones. So these deep-seated tragedies that take place in the author's lives find a way. What haunts their own personal nightmares seems to manifest itself in the pages of their writing. H.P. Lovecraft is a very, as I had said, a very lonely individual, very sheltered from the world. He briefly attempts to go and live in New York City, his only attempt to move away from Providence, Rhode Island, and it's an abysmal failure. The big city scares him, terrifies him, and so he flees back to his home. He's also a noted racist and anti-Semite, and so much of the scholarship recently on H.P. Lovecraft has noted. If you read his stories, you'll find a kind of undercurrent of racism or fear of people who are different than yourself. That's something that we've already talked about with Poe. That wasn't unfamiliar territory for Edgar Allan. But it was even more virulent for Lovecraft. He was notably hostile to people who are different from himself. So that's something to be on the lookout for when you're reading his stories. Why do we still remember H.P. Lovecraft? Why is he such an important figure? Really, he's most well known for his role in the pulp magazines. Weird Tales is the title of a very famous run, and these were magazines devoted to horror and science fiction. They were more pop than serious literature, and so we've come a long way from the roots of Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker's Dracula. We've come from the area, or even from the German Expressionism that's going on at the same time. There's a progression steadily away from the high art and into the realm of the popular, and H.P. Lovecraft is one of the most notable popular horror writers. He's also one of the first to blend the horror genre to sci-fi, science fiction. So many of the stories you read will have a kind of science fiction feel to them. They'll cover a lot of the same themes as science fiction, but they will be predominantly based on the titillating, heart racing, physical response kind of gothicism that we have looked at up until now. So they fall squarely within horror, but he adds and blends many of the elements together, something that will become increasingly popular after Lovecraft. You can think about James Cameron's film Aliens, a perfect example of that, because there you have all of the dressings, all of the tropes of the science fiction formula infused with a gothic monster and many of the kind of nightmarish tropes that we've been looking at up until now in this course. So, H.P. Lovecraft really foregrounds much of that. He is a very unattractive man. Which is maybe mean to say about him. I don't mean to talk about him behind his back, but he's long gone. So, and he is someone who really didn't shy away from the fact that he was a very strange-looking person. He was openly aware of the fact, and noted that it gave him much of his inspiration for his fiction. So you can imagine a very lonely, unattractive person holed up in their house with a highly critical mother trying to make sense of the world. And very shortly we'll be looking at the film Psycho, and maybe we can see some connections between Norman Bates and H.P. Lovecraft and his persona. Okay, so some big ticket items here. Lovecraft is known for his mythology. He creates a mythology all his own. He's interested in the cosmos, in the universe. He has kind of a cult following of sorts, as Joyce Carol Oates notes in her introduction or preface to the collection. There are many people who copy the mythos, the mythology of H.P. Lovecraft, adapt it, change it, make it their own, and so his fiction has kind of had a second life, and it's still extraordinarily popular for fans to use some of his characters or some of his fictional spaces for their own devices. Also, a very gothic theme that we find in Lovecraft, that we've found really all the way through, is this fear of the unknown. And nowhere is it more dramatized than it is in the short stories of H.P. Lovecraft. The unknown takes on huge proportions. It becomes this sublime realm of the past, of space, of things that we can't begin to wrap our minds around. So the deep-seated fear of the unknown is something that Lovecraft is going to take from his Gothic forefathers, but really expand and explode onto the page. Okay, so with that kind of biography in mind, let's talk a little bit about his style, because the Lovecraftian style has its own craft that we can love. Now that trademark, that is a great joke. Anytime you have to tell someone it's a great joke, it's probably not as funny as you think. But still, he had a craft that you can love. His style of prose is very unique to H.P. Lovecraft. So, I'm just going to read here just a few sentences to get the flavor of something that you'll notice is repeated all the way through H.P. Lovecraft's fiction. In the story The Outsider, the first one that we read, on page 5, I cannot even hint what it was like, an unspeakable quality. In Call of Cthulhu, his most well-known story probably, on page 74, the thing cannot be described, There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy. And then finally, in The Color Out of Space, the final story that we read for today, the color that appears in this kind of rustic New England town is, on page 81, almost impossible to describe. So, Lovecraft's style here is extremely stilted. He uses a lot of larger or more awkward words. You might think he is writing earlier than he is. Often people will say he sounds like he's writing in the 18th century at times, but in fact he is writing in the early 1900s. So he uses this kind of stilted, artificial language, and he often uses this exact kind of theme, which is, I cannot even hint what it was like. It had an unspeakable quality. This, if we think back to Savoy's introduction to the American Gothic that we read, this is the Gothic turn. This is, by saying that you cannot describe it, you are doing just that. You are describing it. But by saying that it is something that is far greater than words can describe, it just amplifies or highlights or draws out the enormity of the subject. And so it allows your mind to wander into some kind of sublime realm. It roams freely. If Lovecraft had said, well, here's the exact description of the monsters, of the great old creatures that we have in the story, if Lovecraft had provided those kinds of descriptions, the effect would be much diminished, one could say. By saying that words cannot begin to capture the terror of the event or of the monster, that allows us as readers to contemplate and make the monster our own and struggle to begin to wrap our heads around it. That sense of the sublime is absolutely pivotal to Lovecraft's effect, the way that he creates his atmosphere. So keep that in mind as you're reading. It's something that is repeated over and over again in the stories. So let's move story by story here. I want to make a few points about each of the stories, and then I want to end by looking at the Ingebretson article. And if you have not yet read the secondary readings that I provided, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, the Jonathan Edwards piece, as well as the Frost poem, I've posted those on ENGL, so please do check them out before we start discussing Ingebretson. I think it will help to contextualize a lot of what we're going to say. So pause, go read it, come back, and we'll go from there. So, Call of Cthulhu. This is really the story that launches the mythology of Lovecraft. This is the story that begins it all. Cthulhu itself, this kind of monstrous creature, is described as an octopus, dragon, human. So, I've posted a picture of what a contemporary artist believes a Cthulhu would look like. You should check it out. I mean, there are countless representations of it. But it's the closest thing he ever gives us to an actual description, and it's a very vague one. The traits of an octopus, a dragon, and a human all mixed together. So some horrific hybrid creature that we can't even naturally conceive of, but again, it gives just enough information for readers to make the monster their own. So there's in this particular story, when we're learning of the great old ones, we get to appreciate the unknown, as I had mentioned earlier, and the unknown appears as something that comes way before human existence, way before perhaps the Earth's existence. These great old ones are so ancient that they're even prior to our concept of time itself. They come before anything. It's so far back that it is impossible for us to imagine. And that again, and we'll talk in a minute in some of the other stories, but that's a pivotal part of Lovecraft's approach as well. Is one of his favorite themes, is that time is bottomless. It is the sense that time goes much further back than we could possibly imagine, which is somewhat of an adjustment on some of the Gothic themes or stories, novels that we've discussed up until now, in which you had to have a solid idea of the past because it's the past that is coming back to haunt us in the present. But Lovecraft isn't interested in the past coming back, such as, you know, some crime that was committed or some sin that was committed in the recent past or the past of your forefathers, if we're thinking of Hawthorne's case. In this case, the terrors of the past are so far back that we can't even begin to wrap our heads around. This gives it a certain religious or cosmic sense that we're going to come back to in just a minute, the religious feeling of some of his prose. Okay, the gift here is being ignorant. And on page 52, there's the famous statement about if we did comprehend the unknown, we would flee in terror. If we could possibly get a full picture and fully comprehend the great old ones, the result would be we would flee and go mad. And so in some ways the gift, our good graces here is that we can't comprehend it. And so in some ways, by being withheld from the fullness of the terror of the great old ones, it is good to be ignorant. It's good to be limited. It saves us from total madness. And that's something that we can continue to discuss both in the stories to come as well as moving ahead into the discussion forum. The Outsider continues to build on these themes, talking about something that is infinitely old, which is, again, if you start to conceptualize the temporal passage, infinitely old, it isn't 100 years old, 1,000 years old, 10,000 years old. It is infinitely old. Here, where the Outsider lives, is one of our classic Gothic repositories. It has that kind of old, antiquated, it is the decaying leather books, the mossy covered staircases, it's the aristocracy in its exposed to be taken by the passages of time. So it's another repository of everything we're afraid of, taking us all the way back to day one. In the final scene, it's probably one of his most memorable moments, when he finally crawls out, escapes from his kind of prison, sees a monster, reaches out, and touches the glass, and realizes that it's a mirror. And so the monster is really himself. He all along he had been conceiving himself to be a fairy tale character like the ones in the books, but actually he is a hideous monster. A very effective, chilling kind of realization for two reasons. One, of course, biographically, we learned that Lovecraft felt that he himself was a kind of monster, and his mother reinforced that by being highly critical of him, that he felt that he was this abject creature that no one in the world could love. So it has certain biographical overtones, but even more so, it turns us to one of those key Gothic ideas, which is the monster doesn't exist outside of us, but the monster actually is within, and that's the kind of Gothic realization that we've found all along. It's the terror of young Goodman Brown when he realizes that it isn't some kind of outside force that's encroaching upon his Puritan village. It's the village itself that is full of monstrosity. So a turn inward that is so key to everything that we've read. Lovecraft is just continuing the tradition and building upon it. Rats in the Walls, one of my personal favorites, again tries to demonstrate the horrible passage of time. On page 27, horror piled on horror. Page 28, the countless unhallowed centuries. Here we see these people are going to try to find the base, the foundation of this ancient home. And they go down through all of these layers, layer after layer. The ruins of his family history unfold before them. The terror that is within. And as he goes deeper, he goes insane. And finally, when he reaches the core, the narrator of the story has reached his full height of madness and kind of speaks gibberish. Here we have a kind of very grim, depressing look at humanity, that all of this progress, all of this history is based on this animal-like core. And so there's some people who read that by the end he becomes a cannibal and cannibalizes his party. But most importantly, under all of the guises of the aristocracy, we have this horrific animal-like nature, that's what's at the heart of mankind. And so this is part of why people have kind of accused Lovecraft of being nihilistic, or he's what turns the 20th century horror away from the moral questioning that we saw in things like The Castle of Otranto and Frankenstein, and more into the violence for violence sake, or the meaningless monster that just scares us and there's no deeper message. Some people blame Lovecraft for that. We'll find a counter argument here with Ingebretson, and I would encourage us to continue to think about exactly what is the heart, or the purpose, or the meaning in Lovecraft's writing. In Rats in the Walls, certainly it's a grim core at the base of humanity. And finally, Color Out of Space. Fascinating kind of tale. This is one that firmly places Lovecraft in the New England Gothic, where I think he really best belongs. His spaces are usually the New England wilderness. The Puritan forest has not changed much since Hawthorne was first patrolling it. Here it's preserved its sense of mystery. It still embodies that sense of the unknown for the American wanderer. I do want to just pause for a second to look on page 94 towards the bottom. I won't read very much of it, but it has the vernacular, that is the voice of the rustic people that are the characters in the story. There's more to this nor what we know. Nahum said something lived in the well that sucks your life out. He said it must be summat growed from a round ball, like one we all seen in the meteor stone that fell a year ago June. Sucks and burns, he said, and is just a cloud of color like that light out there now, that ye can hardly see and can't tell what it is. Nahum thought it feeds on everything livin' and gets stronger all the time. He said he seen it this last week. It must be something from away off in the sky, like the men from the college last year says the meteor stone was. The way it's made and the way it works ain't like no way o' God's world. It's summat from beyond. Now, interestingly enough, we don't often see this kind of shift in prose in Lovecraft, but on page 98, the narrator is going to go on to say, rural tales are queer. Rural tales are bizarre. They're strange. They They have a certain mystique to them. So on one hand, Lovecraft is celebrating the American wilderness. On the other hand, these characters, these rural, lower class, poor people, become kind of embedded within the mystique of his science fiction or of his horror. And we can see the danger here, and this is one of the first times we've talked about class, but here we see poor people, rural people, being made monstrous. They are the outsiders that Lovecraft is so afraid of. And so the people that populate his worlds are often kind of stereotyped as hillbillies or rustic country bumpkin type characters, who are just very, in one way, in tune with the mysteries and the horrors, because they believe, they're superstitious, they believe in it. On the other hand, Lovecraft is clearly positioning them as being not like us. And that has its certain ethical implications that we could maybe continue to parse out and discuss. It's a big part of the American Gothic as opposed to other forms of Gothic that we've looked at. All right, Ingebretson. Ingebretson, John Edwards, hopefully you've read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Fascinating chapter from the book, Maps of Heaven, Maps of Hell. Essentially what he's going to say is that Jonathan Edwards, who was one of the first sermonizers, one of the first religious voices in America, created a very puritanical American sense of religion. And so many people see him as the forefather of American religiosity. And it's not a very optimistic or upbeat voice that he puts to it, quite oppositionally. As you've read in Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God, he has a sense that human beings cannot know what the cosmic plan is. There's a sense of cosmic determinism. And so human beings are kind of left dangling at the whims of God. And so to presume that God is benevolent is, according to Jonathan Edwards, a fiction. We don't know what the plan is. We don't know if God is friendly or not friendly, and so Jonathan Edwards wants us to always be afraid, to be constantly humble, and in a kind of Calvinist way, simply wait for fate to do what it will. We have no power, no agency. This sensation is like being lost in the woods, and this is why Ingebretson, I think, describes Robert Frost as being, quote, deep, dark, and Calviny. So he sees Frost as being kind of an extension of this American religiosity introduced by Jonathan Edwards. What's interesting here is that Ingebretson is going to discuss how the Jonathan Edwards type religious sentiments of the American colonies gradually becomes transformed into the stuff of poetry with Robert Frost and the stuff of fantasy with H.P. Lovecraft. And so in an interesting way, opposed to the popular opinion or the popular interpretation of Lovecraft, Ingebretson is going to argue that Lovecraft is the natural outgrowth or the logical conclusion of Jonathan Edwards' original ideas, that he continues a sense of American religious belief along the same line as Edwards. On 133, Ingebretson notes how Lovecraft uses the, quote, traditional cadence of religious discourse. As we said earlier, the unknown here takes on religious dimensions. It is enormous, sublime, and so there is a kind of feeling of Christian mysticism going on here, a sense of the greatness of God, or the unspeakable. It is beyond words. Words cannot do justice to the enormity of that power. Just to draw some of these other points out, Lovecraft, like Poe, is interested in undoing certainty or negating the idealism of American culture. That's on page 147. basically this kind of uncertainty can be read as a form of humility. That when Americans get too idealistic or too power hungry, Lovecraft is there, just like Jonathan Edwards, to remind them to be humble, that they have no power, that they are in the hands of some larger, superior being that controls their fate. For Jonathan Edwards, it is more outwardly a Christian God, but for Lovecraft, he is simply taking this Christian idea and popularizing it or using it to his own ends in the weird tales. Again, just bringing back one of the earlier points, there's a certain sense of grace in the fact that we cannot know the enormity of the divine, that we, by being unable to fully imagine the terrors of Edward's angry God, we are spared from madness or from the complete loss of any sense of comfort. The only comfort we have in the world is our ignorance and our ability to be humble, to recognize that we are lonely wanderers in the woods looking up at the starry sky in awe. So I think it's a fascinating reading of Lovecraft. There are issues, and we're going to come back to them in the final week of the course. There are people who are going to vehemently disagree and say that Lovecraft is the beginning of the end of the American Gothic, that it takes it from its kind of self-reflective, self-critical roots and just moves it into the realm of the grim or hopeless or pessimistic, and that is not a healthy or productive thing to do, according to these critics. Others have said Lovecraft is deeply, perhaps the place that we could go to find the most religious sentiments in popular culture in America in the 20th century, that his voice is one of the very few to preserve a sense of something larger than ourselves in a world that was quickly moving away from it. He was the first one to say, in a world that has lost the ability to collectively believe in the supernatural, it will be the kind of weird tales or fantastic tales that will fill that void, that will become the thing that ritualistically reminds us of the supernatural in the world around us. So, open for debate, something I hope the discussion forum will continue. Which side do you fall on? Hopefully you enjoyed Inga Bretson. I think it's fascinating to think about Lovecraft and someone that we typically think as being kind of a sweet old man, Robert Frost. Hope you enjoyed the Lovecraft experience. We're not quite done with the American Gothic, because next week we're going to be discussing Stephen King. But we are kind of wrapping up the big introduction to it, so we will look forward to Psycho next time. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Get ready. Alright, thanks.